It was the year I turned 34 when something happened that I never imagined possible. My name is Serena Davenport, and my own stepmother locked me out of my father's funeral. For the last 3 months of his life, she made sure I couldn't reach his bedside. Then, after he was gone, she stood in front of our entire family inside his house and proudly announced that my father had left everything to her: the $70 million mansion, the estate, and almost every valuable thing he owned. When she finished, she looked at my brother and me and calmly told us to leave. Most people expected tears. I laughed, because she believed a locked door meant the story was over. She had no idea that by the next morning, I was already driving toward the one place in the county that could prove she was wrong. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, where ordinary people face impossible families and answer cruelty with quiet determination instead of shouting. If you enjoy stories about people who refuse to disappear no matter how hard others try to erase them, leave a comment and make sure to subscribe. During the last 3 months of my father's life, I called him every single evening. Most nights, the phone rang twice before the lines suddenly disconnected. On the rare occasion someone answered, it was never my father. It was always my stepmother, Lorraine. She would tell me he was sleeping, too weak to talk, or that the doctor wanted visitors limited because his immune system was failing. Sometimes her daughter, Belle, answered instead. She repeated the same excuse in an even colder voice and hung up before I could say another word. I spent 8 years in the Army as a logistics officer, and one habit from those years never left me. I write everything down, so I kept a small notebook beside my phone, the same kind I once used to track shipments and schedules. Every call went into it. I wrote the date, the exact time, who answered, and every excuse they gave me. Page after page filled with neat handwriting. One Sunday, I finally decided the phone wasn't enough. I drove the 90 minutes to my father's house. I knew the code for the side entrance by heart. It didn't work. I knocked on the door, and it opened only a few inches before stopping against a heavy brass security chain. Belle looked at me through the narrow gap with a calm expression that felt colder than winter. I asked if I could see my father. She replied that he was resting and that maybe I should have thought about him sooner. Then she said the sentence that would echo in my mind for months. Real family doesn't show up only at the end. Without another word, she slid the chain back into place. I stood there on the front steps listening to the metal scrape against the frame. That tiny sound stayed with me because the truth was simple. I hadn't waited until the end. They simply never allowed me to be there. I drove home with my notebook sitting on the passenger seat and one question repeating in my mind. What kind of wife is so frightened that she locks her husband's own children out of his life? To understand why that question mattered, you first have to understand my father. Harlan Davenport built a building supply company from a single rented truck and 40 years of waking before sunrise. He wasn't an emotional man, but he believed deeply in fairness. After my mother, Ruth, died when I was 22, he raised my brother and me mostly through actions instead of speeches. He taught me to measure twice before cutting once. He taught me that any handshake needing an explanation wasn't worth making. And whenever he spoke about the large house he had finally earned, the one behind the iron gates and long gravel driveway, he always said the same thing. A house isn't bricks. It's the people inside it. Bricks can always be replaced. His study always smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco, even years after his doctor forced him to quit smoking. If I close my eyes today, I can still remember that smell perfectly. My father saved everything. Tax records from the 1970s, warranty cards, the receipt for my very first bicycle. When I was a teenager and complained about all his filing cabinets, he laughed and pointed at me. "You're the one who keeps the paperwork, you always did." He was right. I collect documents the way some people collect grudges. That thought gave me strange comfort while I grieved. My father organized everything, signed everything properly, and kept records for every important decision. He wasn't careless. He didn't leave unfinished business behind. So whatever Lorraine was building behind that chained door had to rest on some paper he had signed. But a man as careful as my father would never hand his life's work to one person based only on whispers and promises. He documented everything. And because he documented everything, none of what happened afterward should have been possible. Lorraine entered my father's life 6 years before he died. I want to be fair about this because it would be easy to claim that I disliked her from the first day. I didn't. My father had spent many lonely years by himself, and Lorraine seemed cheerful and warm. She made him laugh during dinner, and seeing that made me happy. A 65-year-old widower living alone in such a huge house had worried me for years. When he arrived at family gatherings with someone who reminded him to watch his cholesterol and held his arm while walking down steps, I honestly felt relieved. The problems arrived slowly. Almost invisibly, she reorganized his phone and somehow my number became difficult to find. She started managing his calendar, then his mail, then little by little his finances. Whenever I asked my father a question, she answered before he could. Whenever he and I made plans, she later told me he had forgotten agreeing to them. None of those things were crimes. But together, they painted a picture. I knew very little about Lorraine's past until one evening over coffee when my father casually mentioned that her first marriage had ended badly. There had been bankruptcy, the loss of a home, and years she preferred never to discuss. He spoke kindly, without judgment. I stored that information away without understanding why. At the time, it simply made me feel sympathy for her. Later, it explained almost everything. Someone who has already watched the ground disappear beneath them will sometimes do anything to make sure it never happens again. I didn't yet understand what Lorraine feared so deeply. But I was about to learn that real fear doesn't always make people compassionate. Sometimes it makes them ruthless. And sometimes that ruthlessness hides behind the appearance of love. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in March: pancreatic cancer, already spread. The kind of diagnosis where doctors stop speaking in years and begin speaking in months. For the first few weeks, life remained almost normal. I took leave from work and drove to see my father twice every week. We sat together in his study, looking out at the gravel driveway, often saying very little. My younger brother, Caleb, who teaches shop at the local high school 20 minutes away, visited almost every day after classes. Then everything changed. First came visiting hours, which seemed strange inside your own father's house. Soon after, a typed notice appeared taped beside the side entrance. It claimed, with a doctor's signature, that for my father's safety his exposure to visitors should be limited. Caleb was turned away from the driveway twice. I was greeted by the security chain. I didn't simply accept it. I called the oncologist's office and asked about visitor restrictions. I contacted the hospice agency to learn who was authorized to visit. I wrote down every answer. But Lorraine was his legal wife. The law gave her control over the house and his medical care. No hospice worker was going to force their way past a spouse waving a doctor's note. The obstacle wasn't my lack of effort. It was her legal authority. One afternoon, I managed to speak with the hospice nurse, Marin Holloway, beside her car at the end of the driveway. Before answering, she looked carefully in both directions, which told me more than words could. She quietly said my father's mind remained clear. He was fully aware until the very end. Then she said something that made my hands turn cold. He asks about both of you every single day. If he was asking for us, then who had decided that we shouldn't see him? A few weeks before he became too weak to write, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. The handwriting belonged to my father. I recognized those letters before I even saw the return address. Inside wasn't a long farewell. There wasn't even a greeting. On a torn half sheet of his personal stationery, he had written only one sentence: "Keep the paperwork." "You always did." Folded inside was his old Army Challenge coin, the one he had carried since before I was born. One edge had become smooth after 40 years inside his pocket. I sat in my truck holding it for a long time. I'm not someone who cries easily, but I remained there until the windows filled with fog. I thought he was joking with me, repeating the same line he'd used when I was 16. I believed it was simply his way of reaching across the distance Lorraine had created between us. I never realized he was giving me instructions. That is the part I still struggle to forgive myself for. He was telling me something clearly, exactly as he always had. And instead of going straight to him, I drove home. I convinced myself that I would see him that weekend. I believed the chain would eventually come off if I stayed patient and respectful. All my life, I had been the responsible one, the person who handled problems quietly without creating scenes. For once, that instinct failed me completely. Being patient and polite earned me nothing except a locked door and unanswered phone calls. By the weekend, he was no longer able to speak. I never had the conversation that envelope was trying to begin. For months afterward, I carried that challenge coin in my pocket, turning it over with my thumb whenever guilt crept into my mind. Why would a dying man with so little strength left spend part of it reminding me about paperwork? I would eventually discover the answer, just not soon enough to tell him that I finally understood. He died at 4 o'clock on a Thursday morning in January. I didn't receive the call until nearly 9. By the time my phone rang, Lorraine had already selected the funeral home, chosen the casket, and arranged the date of the service. She told me everything in the same calm voice someone might use to confirm a dentist appointment. I stood alone in my kitchen as my coffee slowly grew cold and felt the floor tilt. Not grief, not yet. The grief came later and stayed long. What I felt first was the particular numbness of being handed a finished thing you weren't allowed to be part of. My father raised me. He taught me to drive on a back road in his old pickup, and I learned he was gone the way you'd learn a package was delivered. Caleb called 20 minutes later, his voice shredded. He'd driven over the second he heard and been kept at the gate while strangers in dark coats came and went. We agreed to go up together for the service. I packed a bag for one night. My good coat and the folder, always the folder. I need to stop here for a second. If you've ever been kept from someone you love while a stranger held the door, you already know exactly how this feels in the chest. Tap subscribe and stay with me because what happened at that funeral is the part I still can't quite believe, and the part that finally woke me all the way up. We drove up the morning of the funeral, Caleb in the passenger seat, turning my father's coin over in his hand because I'd given it to him to hold. The iron gates were open for the cars. The house looked exactly like it always had, gray stone and tall windows, except for one thing I noticed on the steps. I went to the side door out of habit, the family door, the one I'd used my whole life. I reached for the handle and it didn't give. The lock was new, bright brass where the old worn one had been. The metal still factory clean, first the chain, now a different lock entirely. They'd had the locks changed on the house before they buried him. Inside, the foyer was full of black coats and low voices, and the tall grandfather clock by the stairs struck the hour the way it had at every Christmas of my childhood. Belle stood near the door with a stack of cream-colored cards, place cards directing people to seats. She handed Caleb and me ours without quite looking at us. Back row behind cousins we hadn't seen in a decade. One of those cousins, a great aunt named Coralie, who'd never liked my mother, leaned toward me as I passed and murmured that we really should have come around more while he was alive. The whole room had clearly been told a story, and in that story we were the children who'd abandoned him. I felt the old urge to explain, to pull out my notebook and show them the dates. I didn't. You don't win a room like that with a notebook. I told myself one thing as I sat down in the back: stay calm. I had no idea Lorraine was about to make staying calm the hardest thing I'd ever done. After the service, everyone moved back to the house for the reception. Caterers, a long table of food nobody ate, that hush people use when they're waiting to leave. I was standing by the window in the front room when Lorraine tapped a glass with a spoon. The talk died down. She'd changed into a dove gray dress and she stood at the foot of the staircase like she was hosting a benefit, one hand resting on the new post my father used to hang his hat on. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about love and devotion and being the one who stays. Then she said it. As many of you know, Harlan and I built our life here together. And I want you to hear it from me. He left this house and the heart of his estate to the wife who stood beside him to the very end. A murmur went around the room, warm, sympathetic, aimed at her. She let it settle, then she found my eyes across the room and held them. This house, she said, was never really yours. He chose me. Beside her, a heavy-set man in a brown suit nodded along, Gerald Pratt, the attorney, I'd learn, and added that the will was properly executed and notarized, all in order. I watched my own relatives turn to look at us with something close to pity. Caleb's face went red from the collar up. My first feeling wasn't rage. It was a kind of disbelief that anyone would gamble this publicly, this completely on a single piece of paper, because here is what I knew, standing there in my good coat with the folder under my arm. My father did not leave loose ends, and a will only matters if it controls the thing it claims to give away. Was that will even real, and did it cover the one thing she was so sure she'd won? Lorraine wasn't finished. With the room still warm toward her, she turned to Caleb and me and lowered her voice to that gentle, terrible register people use when they want everyone to overhear. She said she thought it would be best if we collected ourselves and left before the reading of the eulogies. This is my home now, she said, you understand. Belle was already moving toward the front door to open it, the way an usher shows you out of a theater. Caleb stood up so fast his chair scraped. I watched his jaw work, watched him gather a whole afternoon of grief into one sentence he was about to throw across the room. I put my hand on his shoulder and pressed down gently, and he sat. And then, in the worst possible moment, in front of every relative we had, I laughed. It wasn't loud. It was almost soft, more breath than sound, but in that silent room it carried. Lorraine's composure flickered. People stared. I wasn't laughing because anything was funny. I was laughing because I had just understood the size of her mistake. She had stood in front of 40 witnesses and bet a $70 million house on a piece of paper she clearly never read carefully. And she had no idea what my father had signed years before she ever knocked on his door. I stood, took Caleb's arm, and walked us both out the front door past Belle's smirk and the brass lock in the chain. The door shut behind us. For a second, we just stood on the gravel in the cold. Caleb turned to me, furious and lost. Why are you smiling? He said. We just got thrown out. I looked back at the house my father built because she just made this easy, I said. She picked the one fight I know how to win. In the car, Caleb wanted to burn it all down. He wanted to call every cousin and tell them the truth about the chained door. He wanted to post the whole timeline online. The calls, the dates, the note from the doctor that never let us in. I understood the impulse. I felt it too, hot and clean. But I'd spent 8 years learning that the loudest soldier in the room is rarely the one who wins the argument. We don't fight her with noise, I told him. We fight her with records. Noise feels good for one night, paper lasts. I laid it out for him while I drove the same way I'd plan a convoy. First, a probate attorney, somebody who does will contests and nothing else. Second, the county recorder's office where every deed in the county is filed and stamped and dated and open to anyone who walks in. Third, whatever notary stamped that will of hers, because a notary keeps a journal by law and journals can be subpoenaed. Caleb stared at me. You think the will's fake? He said, I think I said that Dad was the most careful man either of us ever knew, and careful men leave a paper trail you can follow. I didn't tell him everything yet. I didn't tell him about the line in the envelope or the thing I'd known about that house for 9 years and never had a reason to mention. I just drove and let the plan settle over both of us like a blanket. Because there was one document in this whole mess that Lorraine could not have forged, no matter how good her attorney was. It had been filed and recorded years before she ever existed to us. And first thing in the morning, I was going to go get a certified copy of it. The probate attorney's name was Tom Reyes, and he had the calm, unhurried manner of a man who has watched 100 families tear themselves apart over furniture. I sat across his desk the next week with my folder and laid out the timeline. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he told me the rules and he was careful to keep them honest. I can't promise you how a judge rules, he said, but I can tell you how the clock works in our state. If that will got admitted to probate, he explained, the window to contest it was short, a matter of months, not years. The grounds for a contest were specific. Forgery, undue influence, lack of capacity, or improper execution, isolating a dying man from his children, controlling his phone and his money. Then producing a will that hands everything to the person doing the isolating. That pattern had a name in his world, and judges knew it when they saw it. Then he leaned forward and asked the question that mattered most. Did your father actually own that house in his own name? Because a will can only give away what the dead personally owned. I let myself smile for the first time in days. Not for the last 9 years, I said. Tom's pen stopped moving. He asked me to explain. I told him I'd say it better with a document in my hand, and that I was driving to the recorder's office that afternoon. He nodded slowly, and I could see him recalculating the way you do when a case you thought was uphill suddenly turns flat. If that's true, he said, then her big announcement at the funeral was theater. The question is what else that we'll try to grab and whether the will itself can stand it all. Before I drove to the recorder, Tom had me build the rest of the file. And that meant turning 3 months of pain into evidence. I copied out my call log, every dated entry, who answered, and what they said. I wrote a clean statement of the times Caleb was turned away in the driveway. Then I called Marin Holloway, the hospice nurse, and asked if she'd be willing to put on paper what she'd told me by her car. She didn't hesitate. She said my father had been clear-minded until very near the end, that he'd asked for his children, and that she'd watched his visitors get controlled in a way that troubled her enough to remember the dates. A nurse's documented account of a patient's clarity and isolation is the kind of thing a court takes seriously. It isn't gossip, and it isn't a recording made in secret. It's a professional's record. The last piece was that doctor's note, the typed letter that had appeared on the side door restricting visitors. I'd photographed it weeks earlier, again out of pure habit. Looking at it now with cold eyes, the signature looked wrong. The doctor's name was real, but the loops of the signature didn't match the prescriptions I'd seen him sign. Pattern by pattern, the shape of it came clear. Isolation, control of the money, a beneficiary who also happened to be the gatekeeper. Tom called it the classic profile of undue influence and told me that in cases like ours, when the person who benefits is also the one pulling the strings, a court will look very hard at how that will got made. I had the pattern. Now I needed the one document that turned the pattern into a wall she couldn't climb. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office and asked for the title history on the house. The county recorder's office is a beige room with a counter and a hum from the copy machines, and it is one of my favorite places on earth because nothing in it cares how you feel. Facts only, stamped and dated. I told the clerk I needed the full chain of title on my father's property and gave her the parcel number from an old tax bill in my folder. She typed for a minute, frowned, then printed several pages and slid them across the counter. There it was, recorded 9 years earlier. The document I'd been carrying in the back of my mind since the day my father told me about it over coffee. A grant deed transferring the entire property out of his own name and into the Davenport Family Trust. Recorded county stamp in the corner. Date and time printed across the top where anyone in the world could read it for the price of a copy. Under the trust, the beneficiaries were named plainly his 2 children. The successor trustee, the person who would manage it when he was gone, was me. My father had done this 2 years after my mother died, when he was healthy and sharp and years away from ever meeting Lorraine. I stood at that counter and held the cool page in both hands and finally understood the envelope. Keep the paperwork, you always did. He hadn't been teasing me, he'd been pointing me here. The thing Lorraine never thought to check, the thing her expensive attorney never checked, was the most public record there is. Because the house had been in the trust for 9 years, it was never part of the estate her will claim to give away. You cannot leave someone a house that you do not personally own. Her grand announcement at the funeral had been a queen's speech delivered over an empty throne. But I wasn't done, and I knew it. The will still reached for everything else my father left behind. And worse, it reached for the story of who he was. A fake piece of paper was telling the world my father had thrown his children away, that I could not let stand. I brought the certified deed to Tom Ray's and watched him read it twice. "This is clean," he said. "The house was never hers to claim. That part's almost simple." Then he set it down and gave me the harder truth. The house being safe didn't make the fight over. That will still try to sweep up everything that wasn't locked inside the trust. The bank accounts, my father's shares in the company he built, the cars, the investment accounts, and it did something worse than grab money. It rewrote him. A will admitted to probate becomes the official legal last word on what a person wanted. If that forged document stood, then the public record of my father's life would say forever that Harlan Davenport looked at his two children and chose to leave them nothing. That a stranger of 6 years meant more to him than the daughter he taught to drive, and the son who came every day after school until they barred the gate. "I'm not doing this for the accounts," I told Tom. "She can keep her version for one afternoon at a funeral. She doesn't get to keep it forever." He nodded slowly. He understood. To kill the will and clear my father's name, we couldn't just prove the house was in trust. We had to prove the will itself was a fraud, the forged signature, the impossible day it was supposedly signed, the conflict of the man who drafted and notarized it. That meant discovery, subpoenas, a forensic examiner, months of grinding work against a woman who'd already told the whole county her side. Tom warned me it would be expensive and slow. I thought about my father sitting alone behind that chain door asking for us every day, and I told Tom to file. Some things you spend whatever it costs to make right. The first subpoena went to Gerald Pratt for his notary journal. By law, a notary keeps a bound record of everything they notarize, who appeared, when, what identification they showed. It is exactly the kind of paper trail I love, because it pins a person to a specific claim on a specific day. When the journal came back, Tom spread it on the table next to 2 other timelines, and we lined up the dates. The journal said my father had personally appeared before Gerald Pratt and signed his new will on a Tuesday in late November. I pulled Marin Holloway's hospice notes for that same Tuesday. On that day, her records showed my father had been sedated and largely unresponsive, deep in the hard part of the end, not receiving visitors at all. The 2 pieces of paper could not both be true. A man cannot be too sedated to recognize his own daughter and also be sitting upright in a lawyer's office, signing his name with a steady hand. There was more. Gerald Pratt hadn't just notarized the will. He drafted it, and the will named him executor with a fat executive's fee attached to a $70 million estate. The man who wrote the document, the man who stamped it, and the man who stood to profit from it were all the same man. Tom explained carefully that in our state, a court can presume undue influence when the person who benefits is also the one who prepared the instrument, and that the burden then shifts to them to prove it was clean. I looked at the 2 impossible dates side by side. "So either Dad rose from a sedated bed to sign," I said, "or somebody signed for him." Tom didn't answer. He just circled the date and read. Whose hand had actually held that pen? To answer that, we hired a forensic document examiner, a quiet woman named Patricia, who'd spent 30 years telling courts whether ink told the truth. She needed known samples of my father's real signature, the more the better, from around the same period. This is where my whole strange life of keeping paper finally paid for itself. I had his signature on the recorded deed. I had it on the note from the envelope, that last torn half sheet. I had it on tax filings, on the title to the old pickup, on a birthday card from the year before. Patricia laid them out alongside the signature on the new will and worked for 2 weeks with a loop and a camera. When her preliminary report came, it was written in the careful hedged language experts use, but the meaning underneath was plain. The signature on the will was not consistent with the known samples. It showed the hallmarks of a simulation, a hand copying a shape rather than writing its own name, tremor in the wrong places, pen lifts where my father never lifted, pressure that started and stopped like someone tracing. My father wrote his name 10,000 times the same confident way. The name on that will had been drawn by someone working slowly watching a model. I sat with that report a long time. Part of me had hoped right up to then that there was some innocent explanation that grief had made me suspicious. There wasn't. Someone had forged my dying father's name to steal his life's work and erase his children from his story. If you're still with me, thank you. This next part is why I've kept every receipt of my whole life. Before we walk into that courtroom, tap like so more people see how this turned out. Then stay because Lorraine still thought she was winning. While we built our file in quiet rooms, Lorraine spent those same months acting like the war was already over. Word got back to us through the cousins, the ones who still spoke to Caleb. She'd started clearing out my father's study. She put his desk and his reading chair up for sale and changed the name on the household accounts. She had Belle posting photographs from inside the house, the two of them on the wide stone steps, captions about new beginnings and blessings. One cousin told me gently that the study didn't even smell the same anymore. Lorraine had filled it with those thick scented candles, vanilla and synthetic musk, and underneath them, the cedar and pipe tobacco that had been my father for 60 years was simply gone. That detail stayed with me longer than any of the money. She wasn't just taking the house, she was scrubbing him out of it. When Tom's first filing landed and she finally understood we weren't going away, she sent a message through Gerald that I'll never forget. She told him to tell me that I should think hard about what I was starting. You can't afford this fight, Serena. The message said I can wait you out. She wasn't entirely wrong about the money. Litigation against a $70 million estate is not cheap, and she knew Caleb taught shop and I ran a small freight company. She was betting that grief plus legal bills would make us fold the way most families do. It's a good bet. Usually most people can't stomach years of it. What she didn't factor in was that I wasn't planning to outspend her. I was planning to outdocument her, and the most important document already had a county stamp on it. Let her wait. The clock she was relying on was the same one running against her. There was one afternoon I almost felt sorry for her. Tom had arranged for me to collect a few personal items. The trust clearly entitled me to my mother's wedding ring, some photographs, my father's coins twin he'd kept in the desk. Lorraine wasn't supposed to be home. She was. I found her in the kitchen at the long table and she didn't hear me at first. The table was covered in paper, but not the kind I deal in. Old paper, past due notices in faded envelopes, a foreclosure letter soft with handling, bank statements from years back with red ink across the bottom. Her hands were shaking as she sorted them and she was talking to herself very low. Not again, she said. Not back to nothing, not again. And for 1 second I saw the whole shape of her. A woman who had once lost everything, who had felt the floor open, and who had decided she would never ever feel it again, no matter who she had to lock out to stay safe. I understood her then. I genuinely did. I could pity the fear that drove her. But she looked up and saw me, and whatever softness had been on her face snapped shut like that brass chain. She stood, gathered the old letters against her chest, and said the thing that ended my pity for good. Your brother is going to walk away from this with nothing, she said. I'll make sure of it. Cold and flat, aimed at the gentlest person I know, and there it was. I could feel sorry for the woman who'd been poor and scared. I could not feel sorry for the woman who'd bolted the door against a dying man's children and would now reach across the table to hurt my brother. Just to win. The fear explained the door. It did not excuse it. Around the 5th month, Caleb wanted to quit. I didn't blame him. The legal bills had eaten his summer savings. Half the family wouldn't return his calls, and the other half kept asking why he was dragging the family name through court instead of letting his grieving stepmother have her peace. He came over one night and sat at my kitchen table looking 10 years older than 30. Maybe we just let her have it, he said. The house, the money, all of it, I don't even want it. I just want to stop feeling like this. I let him say it. Then I reached into the drawer and put 2 things on the table between us. The certified deed and our father's torn note. Keep the paperwork. You always did. I reminded him what Marin Holloway told me by her car. That Dad asked for us every single day, right to the end, while a stranger told us he didn't want to see us. This was never really about the house, Caleb. I said the house was already ours the day Dad signed that deed 9 years ago. This is about the lie. She's telling the whole county that Dad threw us away. If we quit now, that lie becomes the official record. It becomes the truth. Caleb's eyes filled. He picked up the note and read it again. that single line in our father's hand. He didn't say anything for a long minute. Then he sat it down, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and nodded once, the way he used to nod before a wrestling match in high school when he'd decided not to lose. "Okay," he said. "Then we finish it?" I put the papers back in the drawer. The hearing was 3 weeks out. Discovery has a way of turning over rocks, and under one of them we found the doctor's note. I'd always thought that typed letter on the side door was the ugliest thing in the whole affair, because it was the instrument that kept us away while he was still alive. Tom subpoenaed the oncologist's office for their records, including any visitor restrictions they'd ever issued for my father. Their answer came back short and devastating. The practice had never issued any such letter. They had no record of recommending that visitors be limited. The physician's office confirmed in writing that the signature on the letter taped to the door was not his. It had been forged the same way the will had been forged by someone who needed a piece of official-looking paper to do a cruel and deliberate job. That changed the shape of everything. The forged will was a theft of money and reputation, but the forged doctor's note was proof of intent. It showed that the isolation hadn't been an accident of a sick man's wishes or an overcautious spouse. Someone had manufactured medical authority for the specific purpose of keeping us out, and had done it months before the will was ever signed. It was a plan executed in stages with fake paper at every step. When Tom told me, I had to walk outside and stand in the cold for a while. All those nights I sat with my notebook by the phone, blaming myself for being too patient, too polite. I hadn't failed to push hard enough. I'd been fighting a wall built on forgery. And no amount of pushing gets you past a lie wearing a doctor's signature. The guilt I'd carried for months loosened its grip just slightly. I went back inside and added the letter to the file. 2 weeks before the hearing, the offer came. Gerald Pratt called Tom and proposed a settlement, and on paper it looked generous. Split the contested estate down the middle, everyone walks away. No trial, there was one condition: we'd sign a confidentiality agreement, no public findings, no mention of forgery. No statement on the record about how the will was made or how my father had been kept from us. Lorraine would keep her good name in the county, and the official story would simply be that two families reached a quiet, amicable agreement. Tom laid it out plainly and told me it was my decision. He reminded me that trials are uncertain, that even a strong case can break in a courtroom, that the money on offer was real and the money at trial was not guaranteed. I thought about it for one night. I understood the appeal. It was the safe, responsible, conflict-avoiding move, the kind I'd made my whole life. And that was exactly why I said no, because the money was never the point. A confidentiality agreement would lock the lie in place. It would let Lorraine keep telling the version where my father chose her over his children. Only now, with my signature, paying for her silence. I don't want more than my father gave us, I told Tom. I want the truth he'd recognize. If we went to that hearing, the deed, the impossible dates, the forged signatures, all of it would go on the public record where anyone could read it for the price of a copy. The same place my father had hidden the truth 9 years before, he'd trusted the record. So would I. Tom relayed the rejection. The settlement window closed, and the date that had been 3 weeks away was suddenly very close, and I started getting the file ready. I prepared for that hearing the way I used to prepare a shipment manifest item by item, until there was nothing left to surprise me. Tom and I built the file into a sequence, each piece setting up the next. First, the certified recorded deed to show the house had been in trust for 9 years and was never the estate's to give. Second, the notary journal beside the hospice records to show my father was sedated and unresponsive on the day he supposedly signed. Third, Marin Holloway's sworn account of his clarity and his daily asking for us. Fourth, Patricia's forensic report on the simulated signature. Fifth, the oncologist's written confirmation that the doctor's note was forged. 5 documents in order, each one a brick. I did not write a speech. I've watched people lose by performing their grief, by getting loud and letting the other side paint them as unstable. That wasn't going to be me. What I practiced alone in my kitchen the night before was something stranger. I practiced keeping my voice level. I read my key sentences out loud over and over, slow and even until I could say the worst facts about my father's last months without my voice climbing. The plan was simple. Let the papers do the shouting. The night before, I couldn't sleep, and around midnight, I found myself thinking about that grandfather clock in the foyer. The one that struck the hour at every Christmas of my life. The one that had chimed while Lorraine told the room the house was hers. In my mind, I could hear it ticking, steady and patient, counting down to the morning. Lorraine, I knew, had prepared a speech. She was good at speeches. I had prepared a file. We were about to find out which one a judge believed. The hearing was held in a small wood-paneled probate courtroom that smelled of old varnish and radiator heat. We got there early. I wore my good coat and carried a single thin leather folder because I'd learned long ago that the person who needs the biggest stack of paper is usually the one bluffing. Caleb sat beside me, steady for once, our father's coin in his closed fist. Marin Holloway came in a few minutes later in her nurse's cardigan and gave me a small nod from across the room. Then Lorraine arrived, and she arrived like the lady of a manor in black, with pearls moving through the gallery as if she were greeting guests at her own event. Belle trailed behind her phone up filming until a bafe made her put it away. Gerald Pratt came last, and Gerald looked like a different man than the one who'd nodded along at the funeral. He kept cleaning his glasses on his tie and glancing at the door. A few relatives had come to watch, Coralie among them, settling into the gallery for the show. When the clerk handed our exhibit list to the other table, I watched Gerald read it. I watched his eyes move down the line. Recorded deed, notary journal, hospice records, forensic examination, physician statement, and I watched the color leave his face. He leaned over and whispered something urgent to Elraine. For the first time since she'd stood at the foot of my father's staircase, I saw her blink. Just once, a small uncertainty crossing a face that had been so sure for so long. The judge came in. We all stood. I rested my hand flat on the thin folder in front of me and felt underneath the grief and the months of fighting something very close to calm. The papers were in order. It was time. Lorraine's side went first, and they went exactly as I'd expected. Gerald stood and presented the will, his voice working hard to sound certain, and laid out the simple story. A devoted wife, a grateful husband, a properly executed will leaving her the house and the heart of the estate. He used the word valid several times, the way you press on a bruise, hoping it stops hurting. Then it was our turn, and Tom did something quiet and devastating. He didn't argue. He just started laying paper on the table. He set down the certified grant deed recorded 9 years earlier and walked the judge through it line by line. The property had been transferred out of my father's personal ownership and into the Davenport family trust. The beneficiaries were his 2 children. It had a county stamp and a date that predated Lorraine's marriage by 3 years. Your Honor, Tom said, a will can only distribute what the deedant personally owned at death. He did not own this house. The trust did. The centerpiece of this will gives away a property that was never in the estate. The judge studied the stamp for a long moment. Across the aisle, Elraine surged half out of her chair, and her attorney put a hand on her arm. I didn't move. I'd waited months for this, and I let it land softly. When the judge looked up, I spoke for the first time evenly, just loud enough to carry. You said the house was never really mine. I said to Elraine, you were right. It was already ours. My father signed it over before you ever knocked on his door. The room went very still. Lorraine's mouth opened and nothing came out. The grand announcement she'd made over my father's casket. The Queen's speech that had turned my whole family against us had just been revealed for what it was. A speech delivered over an empty throne. The house was only the first brick. Tom moved to the will itself, and now he reached for the 2 timelines. He placed Gerald Pratt's own notary journal in front of the judge, open to the entry that said, my father had personally appeared and signed his will on a Tuesday in late November. Then beside it he laid the hospice records for that same day. The judge read them both. On that Tuesday, the nurse's clinical notes showed, my father had been heavily sedated and largely unresponsive in the final decline, receiving no visitors. Tom let the silence do its work, then called Marin Holloway. She took the stand in her cardigan and spoke plainly, the way nurses do. Under oath, she described a patient whose mind had stayed clear nearly to the end, who asked for his son and daughter every single day, and whose visitors she had come to believe were being controlled by the household in a way that had troubled her enough to note the dates. Then Tom asked her the simple question: on the day the notary journal claimed my father signed his will, could he have sat in an attorney's office and signed a legal document? Men looked at the judge. No, she said, not that day. He couldn't have held the pen. I watched Gerald Pratt across the aisle. He'd stopped cleaning his glasses. He was very still. The stillness of a man watching his own signature become the most dangerous thing in the room. Because his journal was supposed to be his protection, the proof that everything was done right. Instead, it had pinned him to a date that the medical records made impossible. 2 pieces of paper, both bearing his stamp, calling each other liars in front of a judge. There was only one question left, and Tom turned to ask it. Tom called Patricia, the document examiner, and she walked the judge through her findings with 30 years of plainness behind every word. She'd compared the signature on the will to my father's known signatures from the deed, the tax filings, the note, the old card. The Snort's signature on the will, she testified, showed the classic signs of a simulation, the slow tremor of a hand copying a shape, pen lifts in places my father never lifted. Pressure that started and stopped like tracing rather than writing. It was, in her professional opinion, not written by the same hand that signed every other document in evidence. Then Tom laid down the last brick, the oncologist's written statement confirming that the doctor's note restricting visitors had also been forged. The physician's signature copied without his knowledge. The judge turned to Gerald Pratt and asked him to explain how he came to draft a will that named himself executive, no Doria as it himself, and stamp it as signed on a day the medical records showed the signer was unconscious. Tom noted carefully that in our state a court may presume undue influence when the person who prepared the instrument is also a beneficiary, and that the burden would be on Mr. Pratt to rebut it. Gerald opened his mouth and closed it. He had no answer that wasn't worse than silence. I looked at Lorraine then and I said the second thing I'd come to say, still quiet, still level. You told me I couldn't afford this fight, I said. It turned out I didn't have to, I only had to file on time and tell the truth. The grandfather clock from my childhood wasn't in that room, but I swear I heard it anyway. The steady patient ticking my father had taught me to trust, finally striking the hour. That was when Lorraine broke. She came up out of her chair, and the composure she'd worn since the funeral fell away all at once. She told the room she had nursed him, that she had stayed when his own children ran, that she'd earned every brick of that house. Her voice climbed and cracked. Belle was crying behind her, loud and angry, calling us ungrateful. The judge asked for order. Lorraine didn't hear it. She kept going, pointing at me, telling the court I'd never been there, I'd abandoned my father. I was a stranger trying to steal from a grieving widow. The thing she didn't understand even then was that the more she shouted, the smaller she got. I didn't raise my voice. I waited until she ran down, and then I spoke into the quiet she left behind slowly so every word had room. I talked about the new lock on the side door. The family door changed before they'd even buried him. I talked about the brass chain and the 3 months of voicemail. I talked about a nurse who told me by her car that my father asked for his children every single day. I didn't accuse, I just laid it down. The way Tom had laid down the paper, fact after fact, level and unhurried. By the time I finished, the loudest person in the room had become the least believed. The judge ruled from the bench. The will was denied admission to probate. The estate would pass under the trust, and as to the rest, under the law of interstate succession to my father's children. The court referred Gerald Pratt's conduct to the state bar and noted the evidence of forgery for the district attorney's review. Lorraine sat down hard and the clock somewhere finished striking. Outside the courtroom in the wide marble hallway, Caleb put his arms around me and held on, shaking the way he hadn't let himself since the funeral. He still had the coin in his fist. Neither of us said much. People filed out past us, the cousins who'd come for a show and gotten a different one. The great aunt who'd told me we should have come around more, who now wouldn't meet my eyes. The record was the record now, public and stamped. Lorraine came out last, smaller somehow. Belle holding her arm. For months, I'd pictured what I'd say to her if I won. Something sharp. Something that would land the way her funeral speech had landed on me. When the moment came, I didn't want any of it. She passed close, and for once she had nothing to say. I stopped her, my voice level, no heat in it at all. "The keys," I said. "You can hand them back now." She didn't answer. She kept walking toward the doors, and I let her go. I'd spent so long picturing revenge as something loud. It turned out the truest version was a clerk's stamp, a level voice, and a brass key that would soon turn in a lock that had been changed against me. But I already knew the part that would have made my father proudest wasn't the verdict. It was what Caleb and I were about to do with the house. The aftermath was quieter than the fight. The forged will was thrown out, and the trust did exactly what my father had built it to do 9 years before. It carried the house safely to his children. The accounts and the company shares came back to Caleb and me under the law. Gerald Pratt's troubles were only beginning. The state bar opened an investigation, and within the year he no longer practiced law in our state. Lorraine lost her grip on all of it. She kept what was legally hers from the marriage, which I never contested. I'd meant what I told Tom. I didn't want more than my father gave, but the mansion, the company, the version of the story where she'd won, all of it slipped away. She left the county before the next winter. I heard Belle quietly deleted the photographs of the wide stone steps and the new beginnings captions until the account was empty. I felt no rush of triumph, only tired and clean, the way you feel after a long, necessary job. Some doors, once you've heard them change shut against you, you don't fully open again. But I didn't slam them either. That wasn't what my father taught the first time I went.